I am delighted to be here with you tonight because I like to tell you about my life experiences in the world. And so thank you very much for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here with friends and to see new friends. As Raquel said, I was a television news reporter for many, many years in Boston, the first African-American television news reporter there, which was a huge deal back in 1980. The city had been going through tremendous changes, the city of Boston, and the idea that a black woman could be on the main news was a very new idea. And then in 2001, I was invited to go on a story with a group of Bostonians. Some were humanitarians, some were ministers, and some were human rights activists, about a dozen. And they were going to investigate allegations of slavery in southern Sudan. It was called Southern Sudan then. It was one big country, Africa's largest country, and probably one of the most troubled nations in Africa. And I thought this would be an exciting story, quite frankly, because it would get me an Emmy. I would do things, I would cover topics that you didn't get to cover and go to an exotic place. I knew nothing about Africa, and I was a grown woman. I knew nothing about Sudan. And so I traveled 9,000 miles away, 21 hours away, with a group of Bostonians to investigate allegations of slavery. I tried to get my news director to send a television crew, but he wasn't that interested. He said, it's an international story. We're a local television station. Liz, you go. If you want to shoot your own video, if you want to take some pictures and bring back a story, that's fine. But I'm not going to send a television crew with you. Because the media never really looks, it still doesn't, at Africa with much interest. And so our views of this part of the world are very limited. We think of Africa as warring nations. We think of Africa as troubled nations. We think of the continent of Africa as a place full of AIDS, HIV. So that's pretty much all we know. That's all I knew. But when I got to Sudan, to South Sudan, what we found were people who had been at war for about 3 decades, 2 decades definitely. The Islamists north, a very extreme sect of Islam, not the entire Islamic faith, but an extreme sect of that religion, ruled the north of Sudan. The south of Sudan was religious Christians and other tribal groups, and there was this war that had been going on forever and ever and ever. Millions of people had been slaughtered in this war. Millions more had been displaced. And we were in the South, traveling from village to village to village, interviewing people about their experiences in this jihad, and that's what they used to call it back then, in this civil war. I had never worked in a conflict zone. I had never been in a war zone where people were still under the threat of bombs and under the threat of annihilation. So this was a real new experience for me. And I went as a reporter, but after speaking to people and listening to them tell their stories, my life was transformed. It was transformed. We talked to women whose husbands had been hacked to death in front of them. We saw villages that had been burned down. Babies were thrown live into wells. Terrorism is part of war. And so the enemy does things to not just destroy you, but to wreak havoc and fear throughout the land. And so that was what was happening in all of these villages. And in the midst of all that chaos, in the midst of the madness, we talked to women who had been gang raped. And I had just never experienced that. I'd read about it, but I'd never been face to face with suffering and face to face with oppression and face to face with this kind of trauma. So I got to tell you that when you find yourself in that position, if you're not a soldier and if this is not your life, it can be transformative. I think about when Katrina hit. Remember the waters rose in New Orleans, and reporters were in the helicopters flying around telling the story of the flooding and the devastation down in that area. And the people are on the rooftops and they're waving the white flags and they're asking for help. And if you think about it, the reporter's job is to be removed and distant from the suffering and just to have this kind of objective view of what's going on. But every once in a while, I believe, after my experiences in Sudan, every once in a while, you are called to step across that line of objectivity and do something. I found that was my situation in South Sudan. It was not enough to tell a cool, distant story. Something had to be done. Now, I would like, and I hope I write the book about heroism and that I stepped up to the plate immediately, but that was not the case. I traveled with a group of very heroic people who, when we were confronted with the stories of rape and terrorism and burned villages and families who were destroyed, and the story of slavery, because in the midst of all of this, the people in the North were taking the people in the South into forced labor. They would march them north hundreds of miles to work on farms, and they were used as slavery, because the problem in Sudan was not just racial, Arabs against African, not just religious, Islamists against Christians. It was not just poverty. It was not just oil. It was not just land. There was this sense of people being less than human, and that was part of this war that was going on. And so people were taken north and used as chattel, used as slaves. You could buy a cow in this part of the world for $100. You could buy a woman for $33. And you can think of slavery as something exotic and something that only happens on the other side of the world. But let me assure you, slavery goes on right here in this country. If you ask immigration officers about slavery, women who are held against their will as maids in homes, and every once in a while you hear about women escaping that and being afraid to talk about the people who hired them and then never paid them or never fed them. So there's a lot of pain in the world, and that's what I saw in Sudan. So I'm sitting there with my camera, because my news director didn't give me a crew. I bought my own little digital camera, not unlike the one we brought here tonight. And I'm listening to these stories, and the women are talking very passively and very quietly. And it almost was like they somehow were removed. It took me several years to realize that they are suffering from post-traumatic stress. And having been brutalized like this, they remove themselves as a way of surviving. But I hear these stories over and over and over again. And the people that I traveled with at night would sit around in our camp, in our compound, and they'd say, "What can we do? There must be something more we can do." And as I said, I'd like to make you think I'm a hero, but I'm not a hero. I thought, I'll take this story back, I'll put it on Boston television, and I've done my duty. That's it, I'm through. But one of the women I traveled with, her name is Dr. Gloria White Hammond. She's a pediatrician and a minister and an activist. Gloria White Hammond said, no, we have got to come back and do something for these people. We've got to come back. And I thought that was just highly stupid. I'm sorry, how can two little African-American women, not quite little, I admit, okay. How can one little African-American, how can we go back to Sudan from Boston and make a difference? The problem here is intractable. These are decades of civil conflicts and tribal rivalries. What can we do that's going to make a difference? But Gloria believed that not only could we make a difference, we had a responsibility to make a difference. That if we stepped outside our comfort zones, we could change something in these villages, in the middle of the bush, in one of the world's most violent countries. She believed that. And so we began this journey, and my life changed. Television news just wasn't enough. Working in a removed situation wasn't enough. There was something we could do. So that was 2001. We began to travel back and forth to Sudan. Now remember, this is the year that the terrorists struck New York. So this was a year that the world wasn't traveling, as a matter of fact. As a matter of fact, they were telling you not to go to this part of the world because of the threat of terrorism. But Gloria decided that we had a mission to do. So over the years, we formed a little organization called My Sister's Keeper, based in Boston. We pulled out our Rolodexes, we contacted everybody we knew. We told them we were traveling to Sudan. We told them we were trying to help people over there. And I have never seen people in the remote sections of South Sudan who have no infrastructure. There are no hospitals. There are no schools. Girls in South Sudan have never been educated. Has anybody here read Nicholas Kristof's Half the Sky? It's a wonderful book, right? It talks about women in the world, in the developing world. And it says that the problem with the developing world and the problem with these countries where you have more of these political flare-ups and these real issues of violence, usually if you investigate, you'll find that women in those countries are not educated. Am I right? And so Afghanistan is an issue. Pakistan is an issue. A lot of the countries in the Middle East because of cultural issues. And a lot of places in Africa, East Africa, are the same. Sudan, women are not educated in South Sudan. And they want to be educated. So as we travel back and forth, building relationships with this one particular village in South Sudan, thanks to some friends who helped us from that first trip, we asked the people what they wanted. Gloria wanted to know, how can we help you? What can we do? Well, first of all, they wanted the war to end. And I knew two women from Boston had no way of trying to, let's just go to the president and say end the war. That was not happening. But the second thing they wanted was a school. And schools were really important to them. And so that began our adventure of trying to build a school. And I tell you this not because I'm extraordinary, not because I'm some big deal or Gloria was some big deal, but the idea, I think it was Margaret Mead who said that never forget that you can change the world. A few people can change the world. I think I'm paraphrasing. You don't have to have all the resources you think you need to make changes in places that you've never been. You can actually do it based on passion and a desire to do it. That's what we did. And that experience has affected everything else in my life. Because I now know you can make a difference in the world. You can make a difference in the world. And it really kind of is up to us to do it. It really kind of is, which was Gloria's a theory. So we're going back and forth to this village of Akan. This is the village we ended up settling on and the relationships we built. We learned to work with the people. We learned a little bit more about their culture. We would come back to Boston and I would shoot my video in the village and I'd come back to Boston and we'd do these fundraisers to try to get this school built. We learned what building a school was all about. It took many years. It took us 7 years, as a matter of fact. It cost, I think, more than $200,000 because we had to bring all the material into the village. We were traveling back and forth. It was just an extraordinary part of life. In the meantime, Gloria decided that God had told her I had been called into ministry. Now I'm traveling back and forth to Sudan. I have no idea what I've been called to, but I leave television and go into ministry. But my whole life changed around this attitude that we could make a difference in another part of the world. I learned more about myself after being in Sudan than anything. I certainly learned about Africa. When I was a child, the only thing I knew about Africa was what I saw on the Tarzan movies. Now, you're too young to know this. This was back when there was only 3 channels on television. Y'all have no idea what I'm talking about. Television was in black and white. And here's the shocker. You actually had to get up to go and change those bad boys. It was a whole nother world. Every Saturday morning, I would watch Tarzan movies. Now, Tarzan was this guy, Johnny Weissmuller. That's how old I am. I don't see anyone here who knows who Johnny Weissmuller was. But he was a buff, handsome guy, white guy, who was the king of the jungle. Now, think about that for just a minute. Every Saturday morning on the Tarzan movies, I would watch Johnny Weissmuller as Tarzan. He would only have this little thing draped around him, really buff. He would be chased through the jungle every Saturday morning by about 500 Africans. We didn't know what tribe they belonged to. They had no speaking roles, but they were mad. It took me about 20 years to figure out they were mad because there was a white boy who was the king of the jungle. Something was wrong with that. Every Saturday morning, Tarzan would be chased by these Africans across the plains, and just in the nick of time, Tarzan would grab a vine, and he would swing himself across the vine, and he would do the Tarzan yell. I'm the only preacher in America who does the Tarzan yell. This is worth the whole thing of y'all coming out here tonight. Okay, I need a little applause. Every Saturday, Tarzan does the Tarzan yell, swings across the vine, goes to the other side of another mountain, and every Saturday morning, about 500 Africans would go off a cliff. That's all I knew about Africa. So if you ask me, well, what do you want to be when you grow up, little girl? Well, I didn't know if I could be Tarzan, but I did not want to be an African. There was no future in that. My point is, we have such a limited view of each other. Not just Westerners and Africans, but most of the world. We don't see each other. We see what we're supposed to see by media. Now, I'm going to tell you something about media. I've been in media a long time, and they're selling you some things that are not necessarily true. I don't know what you watch on TV, but if you watch Fox News, okay? You notice how you watch Fox News, and by the end of the night, you got a twitch. And you don't know why you're so mad. But you turn off the TV and you want to slap somebody. You notice that? Because the media sells fear, you see. And they sell confrontation. That's the whole point of media. I was in television, I know. There has to be somebody right, and there has to be somebody wrong, and there has to be confrontation. And so you look at the world like I looked at Tarzan movies, and you expect people to be that one-dimensional character. But when I got into this country and went into the bush and got to meet the people who indeed are living in conflict, no doubt about it. I am not trying to romanticize Sudan. It is a rough and tumble place. But we found people with a dignity and a resilience that I have never seen, ever, anywhere else in the world. People who are living in the midst of death and somehow manage to do that. We would go into villages at times and deep into the bush and ask the women who were pretty much in charge of their communities because the men were fighting in the war. We would ask the women, what can we do for you? What do you want? And one time the women said, just tell the UN planes that they've missed us. Now, this was in the midst of the conflict that was going on between the South and the North. And the people would be fed by the World Food Program. You've heard about them. That's a division of the United Nations. And so the planes fly over these very remote areas and just drop the food in these big bundles. And that's how a lot of the world is still being fed right now. And for some reason, they had missed this particular village we went in. And the women were feeding their children leaves from the trees because there was no food. And when you talk to somebody like that, and she's not whining, and she's not really moaning, she's just trying to survive. But it kind of changes your perspective on the world. Because you come back here, and the poorest of the poor are whining. Everybody's whining. Nobody has enough. And we really don't know what deprivation really is all about. You really have to step out into the world to see people who are deprived and still living with a dignity and still living with resilience. This world is an amazing place. And I'm not just talking about Africa. There are people in India. There are people in Afghanistan. There are people all over in China, all over the world who are barely getting by, but somehow are maintaining every day. The thing that changed me most about Africa and about Sudan was the hospitality there. You see, these people had nothing, but they welcomed you. We hear about the wars and we hear about the conflicts, but hospitality in this part of the world is biblical. It's ancient. It's something you do no matter what. If somebody comes into your village, you kill the cow and kill the goat or whatever you need to do to make them feel welcome. In this culture, in the West, significance is what you have. In that part of the world, significance is how you treat your neighbor. And certainly there are conflicts and certainly there are problems, but it was getting a closer look at the other and finding out there really is no other. That first time I went to Sudan, that first summer, and I know I'm kind of bopping all over the place, but I just wanted to tell you that I came back to Boston and I was so excited. I had a 3-part series. I'd shot my own camera, my own video. I talked to these Bostonians about why they decided to go on the other side of the world. We'd done the story, on slavery and talked to women about how they survived slavery. And the third part of the story was this terrorist network that was being built in Sudan. Osama bin Laden, who is responsible, or at least allegedly responsible, for the bombings in New York, built Al-Qaeda in Sudan, in the north of Sudan. So while we were there traveling around the South, they talked about Osama bin Laden. This was the summer of 2001. And everybody was talking about him because at the time, there was some trials underway in this country, the embassy bombings that had happened in Tanzania and in Nairobi, and people had been killed. But of course, we don't pay much attention to international affairs. That's their problem, not our problem. And the people in Sudan, however, wanted us to know about this guy who had come and built his terrorist network, and he had backed slavery, and he wasn't a good guy. So I came back to Boston, and I said, Peter, I've got this 3-part series. Can we put this on the air? This first year in 2001. And Peter said, you know what, I told you, we're a local television station. This is an international story. I don't think our viewers are going to be that interested. All summer long, we argued back and forth, back and forth. Please put my story on. It's really interesting. Not very visual, but really interesting stories about this man who's built this terrorist network. Finally, the end of the summer, Peter says, you know what, I'm going to put your story on the air. And he scheduled it for September 11th. 2001. Honest to God, wouldn't lie to you. It never ran. But that was the day, September 11th, 2001, among all the lessons that we learned, Peter and I, my news director, learned a big lesson. The people we said was them had become us. The problems we said were theirs were now ours. My theory after the 11-year work that I've done in Sudan is that there are voices that will tell you this world is divided into us and them. There's only us. There's only us. And we really have to figure out how to live it together. The world is getting very small in all kinds of ways, not just with technology, but with immigration, with travel. And we have to, and it sounds kind of hokey, and it sounds kind of corny, but it's so real. You cannot listen to the voices that divide the world up because it ain't gonna work that way. There's only us. I was about 7 years old when my father took me to hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Little Rock, Arkansas. I am from Little Rock, Arkansas. My father was a preacher. I hated preachers. I hated church. That was not my style. And my mother died when I was born. So my father took my brother and me everywhere he went because we were poor. And so that meant that any funeral, any wedding, any pastor's aid meeting, anything that a preacher had to go through, I had to go to. And I hated it. But this one day, my dad takes me to see, and I was just a little girl, but I'll never forget it, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was coming off the successful Montgomery bus boycott. This was at the beginning of the civil rights movement. It wasn't even a movement, really. Rosa Parks had done her thing on the bus, and King was trying to make a decision on what the next step of this fledgling movement would be. Would he just stay in the South? Would he travel all over the country? Would he not travel at all? Was this a movement? Taylor Branch, in his series of incredible, prolific, wonderful books on Martin Luther King. One of them is called A Pillar of Fire, and I recommend it if you ever want to know about that part of American history. Taylor Branch says that while King was trying to make this decision whether he was going to step out of the pulpit and take on this movement, that the world was changing in so many other ways. Young people your age were also protesting the demand for change in this country. And so they were picketing down south, and they were doing all kinds of sitting at lunch counters and fighting for rights in their own ways. And they were demanding that Dr. King come out of the pulpit and come out into the streets for this new movement. And Dr. King had a choice to make. His choice was to be in his comfort zone, which was the pulpit. He was an amazing preacher. Or to step out into the struggle, which Taylor Branch says was going over the cliff. And Dr. King made his decision. He took the risk. But what he did that day in Little Rock, Arkansas, I will never forget. He inspired ordinary people to take extraordinary measures to change the world. And that is how the world is always changed, by ordinary people stepping out of our comfort zones, doing something extraordinary. The school we built in South Sudan opened in July of 2007 in the midst of the village of Akan, a very tiny village, and 1,000 girls found their way from all over the region. Some of them had walked for 4 and 5 hours from other villages. They were so excited about the possibility of education that they would walk through poison rivers. They crossed places where they could have been killed by animals, but they were determined to get to school. Right now, South Sudan, which is the world's newest country, is in the midst of more conflict and more problems. And the situation looks bleak. And in the region where we built our school is where the conflicts are happening. At last report, there were about 200 girls still going to our school, the Kanyak school. There is the possibility that that school could be destroyed any minute. And people say, well, why would you do that if it's going to be destroyed and you have no idea it's not going to last? And what a waste of money and what a waste of resources. But I believe you got to do something. You got to do something. I can't guarantee that school's going to be there. I have no idea. But you got to do something like Martin Luther King did to try to move the world forward. And it all matters. It all counts. Any effort. Do I think everybody should go to Sudan? No. I think there are problems right here in this community. There are problems in my community. There are things that need to be done, but we have to step out of our comfort zone to do it. I am now the pastor of a tiny church in Roxbury, Massachusetts. It is located on Warren Street, and Warren Street in Roxbury is probably one of the toughest streets in Boston. And we have to deal with gang violence, and we have to deal with prostitution, and we have to deal with drugs, and that is all just walking up and down the street in front of the church. And I believe, once again, I am called to do something. Will I change that street? No, absolutely not. But at least I'll be a part of the group that's trying to make a difference. And it all matters. And that's my message to you, that whatever activism you have in your lives, whatever community involvement you're in right now, whatever efforts you're doing to improve life here on this campus or in your hometown, it matters. It matters. It moves the world forward. And here's the best part of it. The best part of it, this was about the third or fourth, maybe the fifth trip into the village of Akan in Sudan. And as I said, it's a 21-hour, 9,000-mile journey from here to London or here to Geneva, from Geneva to Nairobi, and then from Nairobi into the bush, 4-hour plane ride into Sudan. About the fifth trip in, Gloria and I are traveling together, and we lose our luggage. We didn't discover this until we got to Nairobi. We'd made 3 stops from Boston. Luggage could have been anywhere. But the problem with losing your luggage is everything you need is in your luggage. We slept in tents because these were villages that didn't have welcome homes or extra homes or hotels. We took our food in because these are poor people who didn't have anything. We took our water in that we bought in Nairobi. So everything we had to take into the villages when we would go. So it really would be an excursion. It really would be almost like safari, except for you're not just looking for the animals, you're trying to survive. And so now we have nothing. We've arrived in Nairobi. Gloria says, well, we have to go on. I'm thinking, well, maybe we can just go back to Boston because I'm always the scared one. When the movie comes out, Whoopi Goldberg maybe would be me, I don't know. But it would be the one who was like the comic relief always trying to get out of town. Gloria says, no, we have to go in because we've come this far. And so we do. We get on, we run to one of those big stores in Nairobi and get a few supplies that we can grab up. The charter's going to leave in a few moments. We get to the airfield where the charter plane picks us up. We only have like a little bag each, maybe with t-shirts, maybe we found some pants, I don't know, but it wasn't much. But when we get to the village, by satellite phone or some word, the village has been told that we've lost our luggage. This is the truth. I think it was our interpreters called ahead and let them know we were coming at the compound at the airfield, and that word spread to the village. So the plane lands, and if I ever write the book, this will be the scene in the movie that ends the whole story. The plane lands, and the people from the village have come out to meet us because now we're friends and they know who we are and we know who they are and we love them, they love us. The women bring us these brightly colored cloths, which are their clothes, which they bring to us to wear because they've heard we've lost everything. The men bring 2 hand-hewn cots that they have built for us. They don't even have wood in this village because of deforestation, because of the war. All their resources are gone. But they have managed to find 2 or enough wood to make these cots. The little children bring us some sticks that you can actually brush your teeth with. There is some plant that you can get, and I have forgotten the name of it, and you can actually, it will clean your teeth. The old women bring us pots of goat cooked goat and okra. And they bring this to us to help us. And it dawned on me that we had gone to save Africa. And Africa saved us. There is grace in this world. There are wonderful people in this world, and there is a spirit, if you will, of spiritual reciprocity. What you give out comes back to you. And so it is of great value never to look at that person on the elevator, on campus, across the street as the other. There's only us. God bless you and thank you.